Recording by Dale Grothman. Henderson's lovely flowers were going to bring him fame, until they walked and talked too much. Such Blooming Talk by L. Major Reynolds. The ringing of the doorbell cut into Henderson's concentration, and he made a gesture of irritation with one outflung hand. But he didn't raise his head or shift his eye one iota from the tiny green thing on his laboratory table. Tensely absorbed, he stood watching the small miracle he had made, and emotion approaching exaltation gripped him. He slid one hand toward a switch, never moving his eyes from the table. The infinitesimal movement of his hand increased the power throb in the machine at his side so imperceptibly that only he could be aware of it. Suddenly, his breath exploded in what was almost a squeal of delight. The small plant on the table was, with great effort, extending a pair of tiny rootlets, and was trying to use them to walk. As Henderson watched, spellbound, the sudden cessation of the doorbell's ring went unnoticed. He stood there, willing with every cell of his body the miracle that would make the small shred of green take its first vital step. Slowly, it struggled to an upright position, stood waving. Henderson increased the power with a trembling hand, and almost forgot to breathe as he waited for the miracle which followed. Several more rootlets abruptly appeared, and now the plant balanced itself on the bare table. Then, slowly, as a long minute passed, one of the roots made an uncertain step, then another, and another, until it was walking unsteadily across the surface of the table. Henderson, his face, even his lips, white with excitement, now reached for another switch. Before turning it on, he adjusted the tiny microphone on the edge of the table. Then he turned the screw switch. Instantaneously, the laboratory was filled with rustling. Then there came a series of tiny squeaks that sounded strangely like a voice speaking. Henderson sat spellbound, watching, listening. The doorbell rang again, but this time he didn't even hear it. Nothing could break the spell which held him in his seat before the first talking and walking plant the world had ever known. He picked up an alternative phase microphone and spoke into it. His voice issued from a tiny speaker beside the plant as a small whisper of itself. "Man," his voice whispered. "Man." He nearly yelled his delight as the small green thing echoed the word. He shut off the mic, then got busy. He sat down and began to plan a vocabulary to educate his plant. When that was done, he would stun the world with a demonstration of his genius. It was some time before he realized there was a ghost of a voice coming from someplace in the room. He looked at the plant on the table, but it was standing quiescent. Henderson stared around the laboratory, frowning. Then a movement at the window caught his eye. His mother's prized geranium was struggling to free itself from the soil in the window box, and it was muttering. Henderson blushed as he made out some of the words that the flower was muttering. That plant had been in the room with him during his most dismal scientific failures, and it evidently had a good memory. He watched wide-eyed as the plant struggled to lift its roots from the earth. One root finally came loose with an audible pop, accompanied by a squeaky streak of profanity. Another and another root worked free, and suddenly the geranium was standing on the edge of the box, its bright red blossom turned from side to side. There were no eyes visible, but Henderson had the chilly feeling that the flower was surveying the room. Then, after a moment, the plant jumped to the sill of the window, from there to the seat of the chair. Then it slid down one of the legs of the chair to the floor. It shook its leaves, lifted its blossoms upward at the amazed Henderson frozen in his chair, and a tiny squeaking voice said cheerily, "Hi, pal!" Then it started across the floor toward the door, muttering, "Somebody's got to answer that damn doorbell." Henderson's legs came unfrozen as it went through the doorway, and he made a wild dash after the walking geranium. It was padding down the hall, its roots making little padding sounds on the linoleum as he passed it. Henderson opened the door, and only then did he begin to realize the scope his rays must have. He stood, jaws agape, looking down at the rose bush which stood outside the door. His mouth opened, and the words tried to come out. But the bush spoke first. "I have been ringing this bell for hours," it said petulantly. "Some nasty boys have been picking my roses. I'm getting sore." Henderson fainted then, and the last thing he remembered was the voice of the geranium saying, "Hi, babe, come on in. I've been watching you for a long time." The end of Such Blooming Talk by L. Major Reynolds.